Hi everyone, welcome to this particular episode of Sema Budget Podcast, and today we are here to unpack the finance bill. On set today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, and I would want to give them an opportunity for them to introduce themselves before we proceed with this particular conversation. So we can start with the far left.
Hi everyone, my name is Faith Ann Kinyanjui and I work with the International Budget Partnership. Glad to be here today to unpack the finance bill for the nth time now. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Cuba Houghton. I work at the International Budget Partnership as well. Outside of my professional work, I'm also a religious taxpayer, and so I have a bit of skin in the game. But yeah, happy to be here for the first time.
Thanks a lot, Faith Ann and Cuba, for being on set today, just to help us unpack the so-termed controversial finance bill. And I would want us to begin from a point where, for people who are actually listening to us and maybe getting to hear about this for the first time, which might not be the case. So where does this process actually come in the budget process? Because the finance bill is actually a component of the entire budget cycle. So maybe you can take us through to the point where we actually come to this particular point, Faithan.
So when we talk about the budgeting process in Kenya, this is a process through which governments plan to raise revenue and spend it. So this is a process that has 4 stages. The first stage being budget formulation, the second being approval stage, then we have the implementation stage and the evaluation stage. So the formulation stage falls within the mandate of the executive. So the National Treasury at the national level, if it's at the county level, this will be within the county treasury. They come together, however they do. They write budgets. Formulation is the word. They prepare budgets, they write them, they lay out everything in accordance with what each department will require. That's the formulation stage. Then we have the approval stage. So after budgets have been formulated, they are tabled in the assembly or parliament at the national level. So parliament are mandated with 3 roles. So they have the representation role, where they represent the people who elected them. Then they have the oversight role, they oversight the executive, and then they have the legislative role, which is where they make approved laws. So the budgets are one of the things that have to go through parliament to be approved. So when budgets have been formulated, they go to parliament, then they're approved there. The parliament will deliberate, then they can approve with or without amendments. So this is something that parliament has within their power. Then the third one is implementation. Implementation is where the budgets, after they have been approved, they are executed. This is where governments now actualize what is on paper and then get into service delivery. So if we allocated 500 million for a road, this is the stage where that road is constructed. Then the fourth one is evaluation. Evaluation is asking, are we doing things right according to plan? It's also referred to as audit. You may call it evaluation or audit. So the same way you would audit an organization, you would audit a firm, governments are also audited by the Office of the Auditor General. So when we look at this process and the finance bill and where it falls, the finance bill falls somewhere between formulation and approval, because it's formulated with the executive, but it has to be tabled in parliament. So currently, when the stage we are in May, we are somewhere within approval stage. So the finance bill is in parliament as well as the budget estimates. So finance bill speaks to one side of the budget, that's revenue. This is how we'll raise revenue. That's the finance bill. But how we will spend it is laid out in the budget estimates. So that's another document that looks at the expenditure side of the budget. So both of them are tabled in parliament and they have to be discussed and considered with or without amendments. So currently that's where we are at. So we've already gone through formulation and now we are in approval. I should note that there are several other decisions that were made during formulation. So we are in approval.
So Fidan has done good work trying just to lay the background of where we are in the budget process. And actually this is the first finance bill that has actually gained this kind of traction. And this is based on some of the proposals that it actually lays that if passed, will be implemented in the near future. So maybe what are some of these proposals that are actually meant to affect the common mwananchi, as we would place it?
Well, I think one of the, going back a bit, one of the reasons why this finance bill is such a hot topic and very important is because, we're in a situation where there's a cost of living crunch, right? So the cost of living is very high. Inflation is about 7.9%, which is outside the central bank's target range of 2.5 to 7.5%. And so we find that, the idea of raising taxes generally at a time like this is very, sounds very absurd to a lot of Kenyans, right? Because of course, when you raise taxes like VAT and excise duty, then the cost of living goes up. And so for many Kenyans who are already struggling to live, the finance bill, as Fedan has presented it, which is a document that gives various tax proposals and amends various laws, is something that would catch fire easily, you could say. But some of the interesting proposals we see, for example, that would affect the cost of living, is the idea of the proposal to raise the fuel, the VAT on fuel from I believe 8% to 16%, right? And given that, like the president mentioned in one of in his roundtable with journalists, fuel is something that affects all Kenyans, right? And so it's likely to increase the cost of doing business. A lot of businesses and companies and manufacturing firms use fuel as a factor of production, right? And so increasing that will increase the cost of production, which is also likely to further increase prices of goods that these firms produce. And so, that's one. We also see.
So maybe just to cut you off there. So assuming, I want us also to relate with how it would actually affect the common mwananchi. So assuming I am a business person, and what I do is maybe I have this maybe shop that I have, and I actually do deliveries. So that means for me as a person who owns this business, does it mean that I have to increase? Because I'll actually be forced to increase some of these costs because of the implication that it plays. So is this some of the effect that we actually see that it will portend on common mwananchi?
Yeah, I think in fact in two ways. So one, let's say you're a shop that produces, I'm not sure. Let's say a shop that sells vegetables, for example, right? So the farmer that produces those vegetables needed fuel to fuel his tractor, right? So when the price of fuel goes up, and the cost of production for him goes up. So it means that he's going to increase the price of his crops, right? So when you buy them for the farmer, they're going to get a higher price. And then when you sell it to the consumer, they're also going to get a higher price. Because you don't want to absorb that cost increase, right? So you pass it on to the consumer. And then now, like you're saying, maybe you do deliveries to people's homes, right? And so when you pay, as a consumer, when I pay for the delivery cost, it's going to be higher because now the fuel that the driver uses is much higher. And I think even beyond that, for example, there's a proposal in the finance bill to reduce the VAT on LPG or petroleum gas, or liquefied petroleum gas. And if we look at that compared to the fuel levy or to the fuel VAT increases, it's hard to say that this will have a more positive effect because only 28% of Kenyans use LPG, but 100% of Kenyans, you could argue, use fuel, right? And so these are some of the proposals we're seeing. We're also seeing things around that will reduce people's disposable income more directly. For example, the proposal to have the mandatory contributions to the National Housing Development Fund at 3% of your salary, which aside from the logistics and the actual logic of it, is actually just reducing your income. And also for business, if I employ, let's say, 100 employees, that means that depending on what they earn, I'm going to have to contribute that as well because it's a matched contribution from employees and employer. So that is also likely to affect businesses in terms of them increasing the wage bill within the business or the cost of doing business in that sense. And then also in terms of increasing the amount that they have to pay. And so, if you look at it in a holistic sense, it seems like the finance bill is not that friendly to Kenyans. We also find another proposal that is likely to affect businesses is the increase in the turnover tax that's being charged from 1% to 3%. And then also reducing the tax band from, before it was 1 million to 50 million, right? And now it's moving from to 0.5 million to 15 million, right? Which means that you're targeting a lot smaller businesses for turnover tax and you're increasing the turnover tax. And then nobody talks about it, but the businesses over 15 million, right? So for example, if your company earns 15 million in a year, you're going to jump from 1% to 30% corporate tax. So talking about a large change in profits. And of course, like you mentioned, some of these proposals are coming at in the middle of the year, right? So if I've already made plans at the beginning of the year, I've already promised the shareholders things, we find that these proposals are likely to affect that quite a bit, and my ability to stay profitable.
So Kiba has done some quite background just trying to highlight some of these tax proposals and the impact they actually portend to the common mwananchi. In a time when we are discussing this, probably the finance bill is in the process of being approved. And most citizens are asked, the question they ask is, how do we get involved in this particular process? Because several statements are being made left, right, and center. So maybe what's the place of citizens in actually getting involved in this particular process?
Is that citizens have an opportunity, or is it hard? An opportunity to engage. Because earlier in the month, Parliament put out a notice immediately the finance bill was tabled, and they said you can send in your comments, input, anything you want to speak about on the finance bill. The same thing happened for the estimates that were tabled, the other side of the budget. So we had an opportunity as citizens to contribute to this process. And just as is with all other budget decisions that are being made, and it's a good thing that our laws actually provide for public participation, public engagement. For this particular case of the finance bill, we saw a lot more uproar, and there has been calls to just ask citizens, can you write even beyond what Parliament, the notice that Parliament put out? Because right now they're in the process of, I believe it's hearing directly, beyond the submissions, hearing directly from the people on what their input, what their comments are on the finance bill. So they have given audience to a representative group of citizens, all right? And beyond that, there is an opportunity to raise questions with your member of Parliament. Like I said earlier, one of the roles of Parliament, rather one of their mandates, is representation. So they're not there as their own individuals. They represent a constituency. If you're part of their constituency, they represent you. So whatever they do in Parliament, in essence, they're doing it on your behalf. An interesting thing I saw on Twitter just earlier today was a couple of people tagging their members of Parliament and asking them, essentially they're saying, I'm a member of this constituency, I'm also a voter there, so you represent me. I would like to know your stand on the finance bill. Whether or not they choose to respond is another question, but seeing that level of interest from the public to want to hold members of Parliament who have the authority to approve this finance bill, and with or without amendments. So they have the power to say, for the housing levy, tax, contribution, whatever it's being called, for instance, we do not think that this thing should go through entirely, or we do not think that it should go through as it is. Maybe one of the resolves is to say, let it be voluntary as opposed to mandatory. How can we make that happen? For the other proposals like the turnover tax, they have the authority to say, we've listened to the citizens and we think this and this adjustments should be made. So they have that power. So I think right now the power rests with Parliament. I believe they hold the most power right now when it comes to the finance bill. And it will be interesting one to see how that plays out, how they use their power. Will they use it for good or for evil? Whatever evil and good mean here is very subjective. But as citizens, we have opportunities to engage. And for me, just to encourage citizens to want to engage beyond the finance bill. I mean, beyond the finance bill, we have the estimates that are proposing a 3.6, we have a 3.6 trillion budget. The finance bill, what all these measures that are being proposed are so that we can be able to finance a part of this 3.6 trillion budget. So the 2.8 or so trillion that government will potentially collect if this finance bill were to go as is supposed to finance this 3.6 trillion budget. And the other questions to ask beyond the finance bill is, wait a minute, with this 3.6 trillion budget, what are we proposing to do? And are all these things that we're proposing to do necessary to be done? Are they necessary to be done at this particular time? Must we do them in this particular financial year? Or are there some things that we can push forward Like I think I've seen that with some of the projects in various sectors in the budget, where you had projects that had been proposed for implementation in this particular financial year, but they've been pushed forward to 2024, 5 or thereabout. So as are there things like that that can be done so that we do not have a very bloated budget that is way up there and we have to strain to be able to finance this budget, because then financing one through raising taxes that are, as we can see, will definitely affect the cost of living, but also financing in that the deficit that remains, so 3.6 and 2.8, there's a deficit there, meaning that we'll have to borrow more. Is there a way that we can borrow less by cutting down on certain expenditure lines, for instance? So such questions still need to be asked.
So even as we ask those particular questions, I think the one thing that we as IBP are very keen on, and even as we analyze the finance bill, it was one of the angles that we used to analyze. It was just checking on how equitable are some of the proposals that are being made in this particular finance bill. Because the feeling out there is that some people feel as if they are being overtaxed. Some of even the proposals that are being given in the finance bill, if you did an analysis on them, you would see that probably the people who are being targeted, it would not necessarily like have changes, like big changes on some of the proposals. So what are some of these, what can the government just do to ensure that maybe even as they do these finance bills, that they are able like to match? I don't know if it's like something that can be realized to actualization, but what are some of the things that maybe we can adopt just to ensure that we are kind of at par with everybody?
I think one thing to know about, just to set the context, one thing to know about the tax system, right, is that different taxes have different kind of effects on people, right? So when you raise income tax, it will have a different effect on than something like VAT. So the income tax system is progressive, which basically means that the more you earn, the more you get taxed. But taxes like excise duty and VAT are regressive, which means that the less you earn, when that tax is increased, it's likely to affect your income more, right? And to give an example, if you, Irene, earn 1,000 shillings and I earn 100 shillings, and the VAT on, the new added VAT on fuel increases the price of fuel by 10 shillings, it'll take up more of my income than your income, because 10 shillings is 10% of my income, when it's just 1% of your income, right? So the less I earn, the more I'm affected, right? And so when looking at the finance bill in terms from an equity lens, you have to look at it from the kind of taxes that are also being raised, and also the adjustments. So for example, we saw an adjustment on the income tax band, the upper income tax band, where if you earn more than 500,000 a month, your income tax goes from 30 to 35%, right? And of course, we can consider the feasibility of that and whether that will actually raise income, given the I think it's just 83,000 Kenyans that earn above 100,000 shillings. And so we're talking about a very, very small proportion of the population. But looking more broadly at more of the measures, right? You can look at the effect on gender and youth, right? So for example, the digital content monetization tax, or the proposal to tax income that content creators make from the content that they make. For example, it has to do with sponsorships, advertising, and marketing. And so that's likely to disproportionately affect youth, because youth are the majority of the content creators, right? You have to look at, for example, the controversial, it's not controversial, didn't get too much light, but the proposal to increase excise on beauty products, right? So human hair, wigs, nails, I think. These products are luxury products, right? So they're kind of ripe for excise duty. But the issue is that, a lot of the people who work in this beauty industry, right? So a lot of the people in salons, a lot of people, who do, for example, makeup on, TV sets, or for different people in the private sector, is majority of them are women, right? Majority of them are youth. And so, also applying that kind of lens and seeing, how do these taxes exactly affect? Because again, excise and the VAT, they're indirect taxes, which means that when the tax is levied on someone, it's not necessarily the case that that person specifically will pay, right? So VAT is on businesses, or is on production of goods, but it's likely to be passed on to the consumer at the point of sale. And so, those are the kind of lenses that we have to look at when we're talking about equity, looking at how it affects people's income, and also, who exactly it affects.
Thanks a lot, Cuba, for actually shedding light on that. I think we get to learn every time as we actually engage in these issues. And one of the things that I think even civil societies have pushed as we do the advocacy that has been done on this particular finance bill is just asking the government to actually be transparent on the information they give and they are actually required to provide to the people. Because I think that plays a very important role even in ensuring, even for the public, they also know what is happening. That makes it even easy for the government to run their businesses. So when you just check on this transparency issue, I know it's a very gray area, but what would you say about it in terms of even just government tightening their belts on their end, even as they ask us to do the same on our end?
Transparency is important. And I feel especially when you discuss finance matters, you need to be as transparent as possible. You need to be clear that this is what we are proposing. These are certain measures. For instance, when you look at certain new proposals in the finance bill, like the housing contribution to the housing fund, there have been very many questions around that particular proposal, to almost to a point of overshadowing everything else, just because there is no clarity on exactly what this thing is. Another one will be the one on the tax tribunal, where it requires people to, one, if you have a dispute, then you have to deposit 20% of the disputed amount with the commissioner before proceeding. When you look at the discourse around that, one side of the divide, you find people saying, or rather interpreting it as though immediately you've been charged or you've been accused, you immediately have to deposit 20% of that. But that's not really the case. So it's that when you go to the tribunal and you've lost at the tribunal, then you deposit 20% before proceeding. So it's not something that Carrier will come and say, Irene, we think you've not been paying us taxes amounting to 100 million. And then immediately there you have to give them 20% of the 100 million before you even go and try to resolve the dispute. So you'll go to the tribunal first, and then if you lose there, then you're going to the high court, then you have to deposit 20%. Again, there are issues around how fair that is, first of all. And in as much as government insists that you will be able to get your funds back, if you go to the high court, you win within a month or so. Again, issues around, is that really possible? Will that really happen? So again, you see there are various issues around how government is transparent when it comes to the proposals that they are making in the finance bill. And I think that has really just thrown fuel to the fire that is already there. So already you have this very high tax proposals that are being made, but on top of that, there are also some gray areas around it. So even as citizens are discussing this thing, the narrative is very different in various quarters. So that I believe informs also the quality of our submissions to them, because we might make our submissions with one idea in mind, then they say, oh, that's not what we meant. What we meant is this and this. So you see how transparency or lack of it affects how citizens are able to engage with governments. And it also speaks to, like it might also breed mistrust, because if you're not clear as government in what you're telling citizens, then how do you expect them to hold you to, a higher standard? And say, so this is what you've said and this is what you actually mean, and not two different things. So I think there is more to be said about how transparent governments are. We can talk about transparency in government from very many angles and never finish that topic, but with this particular finance bill, we've seen it play out. In the estimates, we also, like in what the expenditure estimates they propose, we also are consistently asking that question. Because you're saying this is what you're going to do, this is what you want to do. Where are the justifications? You're saying these are your targets. Where are the baselines? On what are all these estimates that you're proposing based on? So that's also another angle of transparency in government.
So just building on what Faithan has said, the two principles that actually go hand in hand is transparency and accountability. And one of the issues that is actually being brought up with this particular finance bill is that it actually proposes to raise the revenue targets 4 times as compared to the previous finance bill that was actually passed in 2022. So how does this play out, especially, and I know Faithan has mentioned it when she mentioned that when this happens, people kind of lose trust, because I think even the conversations that people are asking us, how realistic is it, and how do we even know that these funds will be used effectively? So these are some of the issues that are coming up with this particular finance bill, especially on accountability. But I would just like you to shed more light on some of these things that actually even forces the government to be actually accountable to their side, even as they demand for accountability on this other side.
Yeah, so I think, you know, there's two things to consider, especially the question of how realistic these or how, you know, the finance bill is likely to actually affect you know, government's revenue raising ability, and also how realistic are the projections for revenue, right? So, you know, just to bring it kind of home, or more recently, you know, the KRA has been struggling to collect the taxes for this year, right? So I think the target this year was 2.5, was it 2.5 trillion for the current financial year? Anyway, the you know, it's been struggling to collect the targets for this year, right? So just, I think in April they had only collected around 1.63 trillion, which is just 75% of the target. I think it was 2.1 million. And so, you know, when you're talking about even the most recent financial year, the current financial year, KRA is already struggling to meet the target, and there's only 2 months, less than 2 months now, a month and a half to the end of the financial year, right? And so it has, you know, such a short time to collect so much more tax. And if you go back further and look historically over the past, you know, 4 or 5 financial years, we find that KRA routinely overprojects and undercollects, right? You know, with exception of 2021, 2022, which had to do with the opening of the economy after COVID and among other things. But, you know, when you look at it from that perspective, then it makes you question whether the finance bill, you know, is really a rational, you know, or has rational proposals, especially in terms of the target that it expects to collect. And I think it's also important to understand that the pressure behind the finance bill, the reason why, or one of the main reasons why the government really wants to raise a lot of revenue, is to deal with the debt situation, right? I don't think we can talk about expenditure revenue aside from debt, right? Because, you know, if you look at the budget estimates that Faithan had mentioned, 63 out of every 100 shillings that will be collected in this coming financial year will go towards paying debt, right? And that actually means that you only have 27 shillings to fulfill service delivery on top of what now you borrow again the next year, right? And so, you know, we're talking about a very constrained physical space. And, you know, part of the concern around transparency is whether it's clear how government is acquiring this debt, how it's being utilized, and, you know, how it's being serviced, right? Because a lot of it is that, you know, a lot of the strain comes from debt repayment, right? So you have to pay the principal and part of the principal and the interest. And so when you're looking at the finance bill and the whole idea of how, you know, kind of valid are the proposals and how the government expects us to tighten our belts going forward, there also needs to be some accountability on the government side of, you know, reducing its expenditure, especially wasteful expenditure, right? So of course we had, I think it was it last year, the government, the previous president, 2 years ago, the previous president talked about the waste in government of being 2 billion a day, right? And if you times that by 365, that's 730 billion a year, which is almost equivalent to the deficit that we have for the coming year, which is the difference between what we expect to spend and what we collect, right? And to find that deficit, we have to borrow more, just to give you an idea, right? You know, aside from that, you also look at the tax expenditures that the government has been giving. And tax expenditures are basically taxes that you forgo in order to provide an incentive for business. So, for example, in the finance bill, we find that the government proposes to exempt fertilizers from VAT, which means that they're foregoing that revenue from VAT, right? And tax expenditures run at about 333 billion annually, or on average for the past 5 years. And so when you consider the fact that, you know, this is money that the government is foregoing, right? And it's not even clear, again, on transparency, who is benefiting from these tax expenditures, then it's important to consider or to kind of question whether the government should be raising taxes as opposed to, you know, just cutting down on these tax expenditures towards a more accountable public finance system.
Thanks. I think we have discussed a lot of things, and we have taken a different angle just to try and unpack this particular finance bill. But even as we wind up, what would be like your call to action to government, to the citizens, and even civil society, because they also have a role in just ensuring that these processes are actually adhere to the principles that we've mentioned today?
For me, first of all, I think the finance bill is a surface level problem. It's a manifestation of something that's deep-rooted, something that's been growing over time. So right now is when we're seeing, oh wait, we actually have a problem as a country. And when you look at the proposals in the finance bill and just what Cuba has spoken about and highlighting the debt situation in our country. So that's a big driver of why government needs to raise more. And as it's raising more, it still also needs to meet other needs. So we need to fund counties, we need to fund national government MDAs, and all that. So when you look at the problem we are in right now in terms of debt, it's not something that this started in January. So then now is when we're seeing it. It's something that has been happening over time. Over time, we've been raising issues around KRA, setting higher targets and not meeting them. Because then as they set higher targets, the budget also is somewhat higher, the expenditure estimates, because I mean, we expect to receive more. If I expect to receive 1,000, I'll probably have a budget of around 1,000 bob. But what happens if I don't receive the 1,000 bob that I expected? Do I cut my budget? Maybe that will be what we expect to see. But does that happen with government? Not necessarily. So there's also issues to do with fiscal discipline in how government spends. All right, so when you look at revenue targets and then able to meet them, are they going to come back and say, let's cut down on certain issues? There are certain areas that you're not spending well, let's cut down on this. But also being able just to interrogate the issues around fiscal discipline, again, I'll come back to that, and how they're spending money. Because then the effect, the consequences of all this that we are seeing right now are far-reaching. Look at counties, for instance. They're crying, they don't have money. And National Treasury is, on the other side, like, we don't have money. So we cannot really disburse to counties what we do not have. If you're paying 63% of the tax that you're collecting is going to paying debt, and you're only left with around, what's 20 or 37? Then that means you're really working in a tight fiscal space. So for me, I think with government, they need to address their fiscal discipline. One way they do that is also tighten their belts. Right now, in the short term, tighten their belts as well. But even just looking beyond this situation we are in, with higher taxes and seemingly higher expenditure than the taxes, I think it will be prudent if issues around how government spends are addressed in the long run, because I don't think our problem is really in the planning side of it. I mean, our planning process is very, very, very rigorous. It happens well, but then when it comes to the implementation side of it, and collecting revenue is part of the implementation, because we do not budget for monies that are somewhere. So collecting revenue is part of that. Spending what we collect is part of that. Are we able to be honest with ourselves? Government especially, is government able to be honest with itself and say that, okay, we are doing very badly in revenue collection, this is how we can mitigate when it comes to the expenditure side. For me, I feel like when you look at budgets, revenue and expenditures are kind of in a seesaw. So you're trying to strike a balance of some sort. So at one point, yes, one might be slightly higher, but it shouldn't go overboard. So yeah, be honest with themselves and try to strike a balance between revenue and expenditure.
Kiba?
I think as citizens, we need to take how our public finances and how the government is run personally, right? Let me explain. So as soon as you get your ID, right, you enter into a social contract with the government, right? The government, by collecting your taxes and by you following the rule of law, is supposed to protect you and protect your rights and provide for you certain basic services, right? And so it's important that you understand how that process works, and it's important that you be actively involved in that process where the opportunities are, like Faitan has mentioned, around public participation in the budget documents, among other things. Make an effort to engage, make an effort to educate yourself. Whenever your MP says something or politician says something on TV that you don't understand, take that step to actually try to understand it and be aware of the issues that are going on. There seems to be sometimes a lot of voter apathy, or people tend to, especially among the youth, I'm a member of the youth, so I can speak for
for some of my peers, there seems to be a sense in which you don't care. But it's important to, at least if you're not going to do something, educate yourself about it, right? Understand the issue and also how you can do your part in changing it. And I think on the part of government, it's important to understand, yes, you're also the other side of that social contract. And, it's important to understand that you're dealing, when you're signing bills, or proposing budgets, it seems very disconnected from what's happening on the ground, but understand that when you're doing that, you're dealing with real people, right? And you're dealing with people's livelihoods and, whether or not they access, hospital, or whether or not they access clean water, and among other things. But I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot, Faithan and Cuba, for actually joining us today. I think one thing that I'm picking is that we all have a role in the budget process. So it's just prudent that as citizens, as civil society organization, and even government, that we effectively participate in our different roles. So thanks a lot for helping us unpack this particular finance bill. And that has been all from us in International Budget Partnership. So until the next episode, bye-bye.